Edinburgh from 1862 to 2026. A Complete Historical Story. Chapter 1, Victorian Edinburgh, 1862 to 1890. The Athens of the North. In 1862, Edinburgh stood as one of the most beautiful and intellectually distinguished cities in the British Empire. Known proudly as the Athens of the North, the Scottish capital combined ancient history with Georgian elegance, medieval mystery with Victorian progress. The city of approximately 170,000 souls sprawled across its dramatic landscape of volcanic hills, deep valleys, and the imposing Castle Rock that had defined its identity for centuries. The contrast between Old Town and New Town was stark and remarkable. The Old Town, climbing the ridge from Holyrood Palace to Edinburgh Castle along the Royal Mile, retained its medieval character. Tall tenement buildings called lands rose 6, 8, even 10 stories high, their dark closes and wynds hiding centuries of history. Here, the poor crowded into single rooms, while the ancient nobility maintained crumbling townhouses that had seen better days. The New Town, built in the previous century according to elegant Georgian plans, represented order, prosperity, and Enlightenment ideals. Its wide streets, uniform facades, and graceful crescents housed the professional classes, the wealthy merchants, and the aristocracy who had abandoned the Old Town for more fashionable addresses. Prince's Street, with its gardens and views of the castle, was becoming one of Europe's finest shopping streets. Industry and commerce. Edinburgh in the 1860s was experiencing industrial growth. Though it never matched the raw manufacturing power of Glasgow to the west, the city's economy rested on different foundations: publishing, brewing, banking, and the professions that served Scotland's legal and ecclesiastical establishments. The publishing industry made Edinburgh a literary capital. Firms like William Blackwood and Sons, Archibald Constable's successors, and numerous others produced books, magazines, and newspapers that shaped British opinion. The Scotsman newspaper, founded in 1817, had become one of the most influential journals in Britain. Printing works employed thousands of skilled workers. Brewing was another major industry. Edinburgh's water, drawn from the hills to the south, was particularly suited to brewing, and great breweries produced ales and stouts for consumption throughout Britain and the Empire. Names like William Younger and William McEwen became synonymous with Scottish brewing excellence. Banking centered on Edinburgh, where the Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and numerous other institutions managed the financial affairs of the nation. The grand banking halls along George Street testified to the wealth and stability of Scottish finance. The university and medicine. The University of Edinburgh maintained its reputation as one of the world's great centers of learning. Its medical school was particularly renowned, drawing students from across Britain, the Empire, and America. The teaching of anatomy, surgery, and medicine at Edinburgh had revolutionized medical practice, and its graduates spread throughout the world. The Royal Infirmary provided clinical experience for medical students while serving the city's sick and injured. The development of anesthesia and antiseptic surgery during this period transformed what had been brutal and often fatal procedures into survivable operations. Joseph Lister's antiseptic principles, developed partly through his work in Scotland, were revolutionizing surgical practice. Scientific research flourished alongside medical education. Edinburgh scientists contributed to physics, geology, chemistry, and the emerging field of evolutionary biology. The city's intellectual tradition, stretching back to the Scottish Enlightenment of the previous century, continued to shape British and world thought on social conditions. Victorian Edinburgh, like all great cities of the era, contained extremes of wealth and poverty. The prosperous classes lived comfortably in the New Town, employing servants, educating their children, and participating in the elaborate social rituals of the age. Their lives were ordered, respectable, and increasingly comfortable, as Victorian technology brought gas lighting, improved sanitation, and other amenities. The poor lived very differently. The Old Town tenements housed families in conditions of desperate overcrowding. Single rooms might shelter 6, 8, or 10 people. Sanitation was primitive, water supplies contaminated, and disease endemic. Tuberculosis, typhus, and other illnesses carried off thousands every year. Infant mortality was horrifying. Perhaps one child in 4 died before their 5th birthday in the poorest districts. The closes and wines of the Old Town concealed misery that reformers were only beginning to address. Campaigns for improved housing, sanitation, and public health were gaining momentum, but progress was slow. The gap between respectable Edinburgh and its hidden underworld of poverty and crime would persist for decades. The Castle and Royal Mile. Edinburgh Castle dominated the city as it had for centuries. The ancient fortress, perched on its volcanic rock, served as a military garrison, a tourist attraction, and a symbol of Scottish national identity. The honours of Scotland, the crown, sceptre, and sword of state, were displayed there, drawing visitors from around the world. The Royal Mile descended from the castle esplanade through the Lawn Market, High Street, and Canongate to the Palace of Holyrood House. This ancient thoroughfare had witnessed Scotland's entire history, from medieval kings to religious reformers, from royal scandals to political upheavals. Every building along its length held stories. St. Giles Cathedral, the High Kirk of Edinburgh, stood at the heart of the Royal Mile. Its distinctive crown steeple was a city landmark, and its interior held monuments to Scotland's heroes and martyrs. The cathedral had witnessed the religious struggles that had shaped Scottish identity, from John Knox's fiery preaching to more recent ecclesiastical controversies. Chapter 2, Turn of the Century, 1890 to 1920. A city transformed. By 1890, Edinburgh's population had grown to approximately 260,000, and the city was being transformed by technology, social reform, and changing attitudes. Electric lighting was replacing gas on major streets. Horse-drawn trams gave way to electric tramways. The telephone connected businesses and homes. The modern city was emerging from its Victorian chrysalis. The Old Town was finally receiving serious attention from reformers and planners. The worst slums were being cleared, replaced by improved tenements built to higher standards. Patrick Geddes, the visionary town planner, was pioneering new approaches to urban renewal that preserved historic buildings while improving living conditions. His work in the Old Town would influence urban planning worldwide. The New Town continued to attract the prosperous, though some of its Georgian houses were being converted to professional offices as the wealthiest residents moved to newer suburbs. Morningside, Marchmont, and other areas were developed with substantial Victorian villas and tenements for the growing middle class. Culture and the arts. Edinburgh's cultural life flourished in this period. The city's theatres presented everything from Shakespeare to music hall. Art galleries displayed works by Scottish painters who were gaining international recognition. Literary societies debated the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, himself an Edinburgh native whose tales of adventure captivated readers worldwide. Stevenson had captured the city's dual nature in his writings, particularly in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which many saw as reflecting Edinburgh's own split personality, respectable New Town and dangerous Old Town, Presbyterian propriety and hidden vice. Though Stevenson spent much of his life abroad, dying in Samoa in 1894, his spirit haunted his native city. The Scottish National Portrait Gallery opened in 1889, providing a home for images of Scotland's notable figures through the centuries. This neo-Gothic building on Queen Street became an important cultural institution, preserving and displaying Scottish heritage for future generations. The Great War. The outbreak of war in August 1914 transformed Edinburgh as it transformed all of Britain. Young men rushed to enlist, forming battalions that would soon face the horrors of trench warfare. Edinburgh's regiments, including the Royal Scots, the oldest regiment in the British Army, were heavily engaged in the fighting. The city became a center for military administration, medical treatment, and war production. Hospitals received wounded soldiers from the front. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs previously reserved for men. The social changes the war accelerated would reshape Edinburgh for generations. The human cost was devastating. Virtually every family in Edinburgh lost someone: a son, a husband, a father, a brother. The war memorials that would later be erected throughout the city testified to the scale of sacrifice. The Scottish National War Memorial, built within Edinburgh Castle and completed in 1927, became a place of pilgrimage for bereaved families. Post-war Edinburgh. The Edinburgh that emerged from the Great War was changed in ways both visible and invisible. The confidence of the Edwardian era had been shattered. Economic difficulties plagued the 1920s, with unemployment and poverty affecting many families. The great brewing and publishing industries faced new challenges. Yet life continued. The city's educational institutions maintained their excellence. The University of Edinburgh continued to attract students from around the world. New housing developments pushed the city's boundaries outward. The motor car began to appear on streets designed for horses. The 1920s also saw the beginnings of what would become Edinburgh's most famous cultural event. In 1926, the Edinburgh International Music Festival was proposed, though it would take another 2 decades and another world war before the Edinburgh Festival as we know it would be born. Chapter 3: Depression, War, and Recovery, 1920 to 1960. The difficult years. The 1930s brought economic hardship to Edinburgh, as to all of Britain. The Great Depression reduced trade, closed businesses, and threw thousands out of work. The traditional industries that had sustained the city faced unprecedented challenges. Poverty, which had never disappeared from the Old Town and working-class districts, became more widespread. Yet Edinburgh's diverse economy proved more resilient than the single industry towns that suffered most severely. Financial services, education, government administration, and tourism continued to provide employment. The city's role as Scotland's capital and legal centre insulated it somewhat from the worst effects of the Depression. Housing conditions remained a concern. Despite decades of improvement efforts, many Edinburgh residents still lived in overcrowded and substandard accommodation. New council housing estates were built on the city's periphery, providing modern amenities, but sometimes lacking community cohesion. The tension between preserving historic Edinburgh and meeting modern housing needs was already apparent. The Second World War. When war came again, in 1939, Edinburgh faced different challenges than in 1914 to 1918. The threat of aerial bombardment was now real. Air raid shelters were constructed, blackout regulations enforced, and the population prepared for attacks that, fortunately, largely spared the city. Edinburgh was bombed, but lightly compared to industrial cities like Clydebank, which was devastated. The city's historic centre survived largely intact, preserving the architectural heritage that would later prove so valuable. Military installations and the Forth Bridge were obvious targets, but German bombers focused their attention elsewhere. The war brought social changes that accelerated trends already underway. Women's roles expanded dramatically. Class distinctions, while not disappearing, became less rigid. The shared experience of war created expectations of a better post-war world, expectations that would shape British politics for decades. The birth of the festival. In 1947, just 2 years after the war ended, Edinburgh gave birth to what would become its greatest gift to world culture, the Edinburgh International Festival. In a Britain still grey with rationing and austerity, the festival brought together artists from across Europe and beyond in a celebration of human creativity. The founders intended the festival to heal the wounds of war through cultural exchange. Opera, theatre, music, and dance of the highest quality transformed Edinburgh each August. The city's dramatic setting, the castle, the historic streets, the natural amphitheatres, provided perfect stages for artistic expression. Almost immediately, the official festival was joined by unofficial performances. Artists who had not been invited to the main program performed wherever they could find space. This fringe would grow to become the world's largest arts festival, eventually dwarfing the original international festival in size, while maintaining a spirit of artistic freedom and experimentation. Post-war transformation. The 1950s brought slow but steady recovery to Edinburgh. New housing estates continued to expand the city's footprint. The motor car transformed urban life, for better and worse. Traditional industries faced new challenges, but new employers, particularly in finance and government, provided opportunities. The University of Edinburgh expanded dramatically, welcoming larger numbers of students and constructing new buildings to accommodate them. George Square, a Georgian residential square, was controversially redeveloped with modern university buildings, sparking debates about conservation versus progress that continue to this day. Television arrived, changing how people spent their leisure time. The festival continued to grow in prestige and popularity. Tourism began its long rise toward becoming one of the city's major industries. Edinburgh was positioning itself for a new role in a changing world. Chapter 4: Modern Transformation, 1960 to 1990. The 60s and 70s. The 1960s brought dramatic social and cultural change to Edinburgh, as to all Western cities. Traditional attitudes toward religion, sexuality, family, and authority were challenged. The ancient Presbyterian strictness that had characterized Edinburgh for centuries began to loosen its grip. The physical city was also transformed, not always for the better. Planning decisions that prioritized automobile traffic damaged historic streetscapes. The notorious Leith Street redevelopment and the construction of the St. James Centre demonstrated the destructive potential of 1960s planning ideology. Historic buildings were demolished for developments that would later be judged harshly. Yet conservation efforts also intensified. The Old Town, recognized as internationally significant, received increasing protection. The New Town Conservation Committee worked to preserve Georgian Edinburgh. The city's architectural heritage, which had nearly been squandered, was increasingly valued and protected. Oil and financial services. The discovery of North Sea oil in the 1970s transformed Scotland's economy, and Edinburgh benefited substantially. Though the oil industry was centered in Aberdeen, financial and professional services related to oil found homes in Edinburgh. The city's existing strengths in banking and finance positioned it well to serve the new industry. The financial services sector grew dramatically. Edinburgh became second only to London as a financial center in Britain, with banking, insurance, and investment management providing thousands of well-paid jobs. The grand banking halls of previous centuries were joined by modern office buildings as the sector expanded. This economic success brought new challenges. Property prices rose, pushing lower-income residents out of desirable areas. The character of traditional neighborhoods changed as professionals replaced working-class families. The gentrification that would accelerate in later decades was already underway. Devolution and identity. The question of Scottish self-government emerged as a major political issue in the 1970s. A referendum on devolution in 1979 failed to achieve the required threshold for approval, but the issue did not disappear. Scottish national identity, always strong in Edinburgh despite, or perhaps because of, its role as the British establishment's Scottish outpost, found new political expression. Cultural nationalism flourished even when political nationalism was in retreat. Scottish literature, music, and art experienced a renaissance. The Edinburgh Festival showcased Scottish talent alongside international visitors. A new generation of Scottish writers, artists, and musicians challenged old assumptions and explored new forms. The 1980s, dominated by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, were politically divisive in Scotland. Edinburgh, with its substantial middle class, was less uniformly hostile to Thatcherism than Glasgow or the industrial areas, but tensions were apparent. The poll tax riots of 1989, when the unpopular tax was introduced in Scotland before England, demonstrated the depth of feeling. The festival city. By 1990, the Edinburgh Festival had grown into a phenomenon without parallel anywhere in the world. The official international festival presented world-class performances in theater, opera, music, and dance. The Fringe had become an enormous carnival of performance, with thousands of shows and hundreds of venues throughout the city. August transformed Edinburgh. The population effectively doubled as performers, and audiences flooded in. Every available space became a venue. Street performers filled the Royal Mile. The city's economy became increasingly dependent on this annual invasion, with hotels, restaurants, and shops earning substantial portions of their annual revenue in a few August weeks. Other festivals multiplied: the Edinburgh International Film Festival, the Book Festival, the Jazz Festival, and others extended the cultural calendar beyond August. Edinburgh was marketing itself as a festival city, and the strategy was succeeding beyond all expectations. Chapter 5: Renaissance and Revival, 1990-2010. The Return of Parliament. The defining event of this period was the re-establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999, the first Scottish legislature since 1707, when the Act of Union merged the English and Scottish parliaments. The devolution referendum of 1997 had passed overwhelmingly, and Edinburgh naturally became the seat of the new parliament. The first years of the Parliament saw meetings in the Church of Scotland's Assembly Hall on the Mound, while a permanent home was constructed. The Scottish Parliament building at Holyrood, designed by the Catalan architect Enric Morales, was controversial from the start. Costs escalated dramatically from an initial estimate of £40 million to a final cost exceeding £400 million. When the building finally opened in 2004, opinions remained divided. Some hailed it as a masterpiece of contemporary architecture, expressing Scottish identity through its innovative design. Others condemned it as an expensive folly. Whatever one's view of the architecture, the building's location at the foot of the Royal Mile, opposite Holyrood Palace, was symbolically powerful. Urban Renaissance. The 1990s and 2000s saw remarkable urban renewal throughout Edinburgh. The waterfront at Leith, long an industrial area of docks and warehouses, was transformed into a fashionable district of restaurants, bars, and expensive apartments. The Ocean Terminal Shopping Centre and the Royal Yacht Britannia, moored permanently in Leith, drew visitors to the area. The Old Town received continued investment. Historic closes were renovated, medieval buildings restored, and new attractions developed. The Edinburgh Dungeon, the Scotch Whisky Experience, and other tourist attractions joined the traditional sites in drawing visitors. The balance between tourism and livability became an increasing concern. Newtown conservation continued, preserving the Georgian streetscape while adapting buildings for modern use. The remarkable unity of the New Town, with its consistent architectural vision, was recognized through UNESCO World Heritage Site status, which both the Old Town and New Town had received in 1995. The financial crisis. The global financial crisis of 2008 struck Edinburgh's financial sector hard. The Royal Bank of Scotland, which had grown to become one of the world's largest banks, required a government bailout that effectively nationalized it. HBOS, created from the merger of Bank of Scotland with Halifax, also required rescue. The crisis revealed the dangers of Edinburgh's dependence on financial services. Thousands of jobs were lost. Office buildings stood empty. The assumption that finance would continue to drive growth was shattered. Recovery would come, but the experience prompted reflection on the need for economic diversity. Yet the crisis also demonstrated Edinburgh's resilience. Tourism continued to grow. The universities expanded their international student recruitment. New technology companies began to establish themselves. The festival remained a reliable economic driver. Edinburgh began to diversify its economy even as it worked to restore its financial sector. Culture and tourism. By 2010, tourism had become central to Edinburgh's identity and economy. Over 3 million visitors came annually to see the castle, walk the Royal Mile, explore the New Town, and experience the festival. Tourism supported tens of thousands of jobs directly and indirectly. The city's cultural offerings continued to expand. The reopened Scottish National Portrait Gallery, extensively renovated, joined the other national galleries in providing world-class art experiences. The Museum of Scotland, opened in 1998 in a striking modern building adjacent to the Victorian Royal Museum, told Scotland's story through its material culture. Hogmanay, the Scottish New Year celebration, had been developed into a major event, attracting tens of thousands to the city centre for concerts, fireworks, and street parties. Edinburgh had learned to market itself effectively, extending the tourist season throughout the year. Chapter 6: Contemporary Edinburgh and Future, 2010 to 2026. The Independence Debate. The 2014 Scottish independence referendum dominated political life in Edinburgh as in all of Scotland. The campaign was passionate, engaging citizens who had never before participated in politics. Edinburgh, with its substantial middle class and strong connections to the UK establishment, voted to remain in the United Kingdom, though by a smaller margin than some had expected. The aftermath of the referendum saw continued political change. The Scottish National Party dominated Scottish politics, winning unprecedented electoral victories. The Scottish Parliament gained additional powers. The question of Scotland's constitutional future remained unresolved, with Brexit adding new complications. Edinburgh's position as capital of a potentially independent Scotland, or of an increasingly autonomous nation within the UK, gave it particular significance in these debates. The city's European connections, its international business community, and its cultural institutions all had stakes in Scotland's political future. The tram controversy. The Edinburgh Tram project became synonymous with municipal dysfunction. Originally planned to connect the airport to Leith, the project suffered endless delays, cost overruns, and political controversy. When the first trams finally ran in 2014, the line extended only from the airport to York Place in the city centre, a fraction of the original plan. The project had cost over £750 million, vastly exceeding initial estimates, and had caused years of disruption to businesses and residents along the route. An official inquiry documented the failures of management and oversight that had allowed costs to spiral out of control. Yet the trams, once operational, proved popular, ridership exceeded projections, and calls grew for extending the line. By 2023, construction was underway to extend the tram to Leith, finally completing part of the original vision. The controversy served as a cautionary tale about major infrastructure projects. COVID-19 and recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 struck Edinburgh's tourism-dependent economy with devastating force. The festival was cancelled for the first time in its history. Hotels, restaurants, and shops closed. The streets that normally thronged with visitors fell silent. The empty city during lockdown was eerie and unprecedented. Residents discovered aspects of their city normally hidden by crowds. The castle stood sentinel over quiet streets. The closes of the Old Town echoed to few footsteps. Edinburgh experienced a pause that allowed reflection on its future. Recovery came gradually. The 2021 festival was reduced. 2022 saw a fuller return. By 2023 and 2024, visitor numbers were approaching pre-pandemic levels. The city had survived its greatest peacetime crisis, though the experience prompted discussion about sustainable tourism and economic resilience. Housing and affordability. Housing became increasingly contentious in contemporary Edinburgh. Property prices rose faster than incomes, pushing home ownership out of reach for many young people. The expansion of short-term tourist rentals, particularly through platforms like Airbnb, reduced the supply of housing available for residents. Neighborhoods that had been predominantly residential became dominated by holiday lets. Local shops and services closed as their customer base disappeared. Communities that had existed for generations felt threatened by the transformation of their streets into tourist accommodation. The city government introduced regulations on short-term lets, requiring licensing and limiting numbers in some areas. Whether these measures would prove sufficient to preserve residential neighborhoods remained to be seen. The tension between tourism's economic benefits and its social costs was unresolved. Looking to 2026 and beyond. As Edinburgh approaches 2026, the city faces both challenges and opportunities. Climate change demands new approaches to transportation, building, and urban life. The Scottish Government has committed to ambitious emissions targets that will reshape how the city functions. Major developments continue to transform parts of the city. The St. James Quarter, opened in 2021, replaced the unloved 1960s shopping centre with a massive new retail and leisure complex. The waterfront continues to evolve. New residential developments push the city's boundaries outward. The city's educational institutions face new challenges and opportunities in a changing global environment. The University of Edinburgh and other institutions compete for international students while adapting to new technologies and pedagogies. Education remains central to Edinburgh's identity and economy. The festival approaches its 80th anniversary in 2027, having survived pandemic, controversy, and changing cultural tastes. Its future seems secure, though questions about sustainability, accessibility, and community impact continue to be debated. Edinburgh in 2026 remains what it has been for centuries, a city of remarkable beauty, rich history, and vibrant culture. The challenges it faces, housing affordability, climate change, sustainable tourism, political uncertainty, are shared by cities worldwide. Its assets, unparalleled architectural heritage, strong institutions, educated population, natural setting, position it well to meet those challenges. The castle still dominates the skyline, as it did in 1862. The Royal Mile still climbs the ridge from Holyrood to the Esplanade. The New Town's Georgian terraces still embody Enlightenment ideals. But the city is not a museum. It is a living place where nearly 500,000 people make their homes, build their careers, raise their families, and create the future. Edinburgh's story continues.